Xirtus.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
Join us on another exciting adventure of Xirtus.
Well, here we are then. We've done it. We've started it.
Hey, we have.
It's been a long time coming. I haven't done any other recordings like this in a while because I've been so crazy busy. And then been really wanting to do this with Lenny. The last few days, Lenny's like, it's okay. We're going to make it work. And then finally, just the moment happened. So here we are. Lenny, how you been?
I've been rather well. I've been getting outdoors a lot more lately, and that always helps my comfort level.
Totally. I know what you mean. It's changed everything for me to get out of the city. But where are you at right now?
I'm currently in southern Florida, the youngest person I know here.
Not the worst thing to be, actually. So are you visiting your family? Are you seeing your mom?
Yeah. My mom lives down here. It's been about a dozen years since I had seen her, and probably 30 years since I had hung out with her.
Wow.
So, in a way, this is a role play game of Lenny stepping back into his childhood and learning about his roots.
Wow. And you just also before this had taken some time to like study and hang out with younger children a few months ago, right?
Yes, I was working with a Spectrum 11-year-old and trying to get into his world so that I could understand the process of learning. Because when you're on the spectrum, everybody kind of thinks you're normal until you act out, and then they get upset. Really, normal is the stage of acting out for a lot of people on the spectrum. And we've got a lot more spectrum children these days because of all the things that people have done on their own bodies before they procreated.
You have a more intimate understanding of education. You've been through education and you have a lot of thoughts about education.
Yeah,
How do
I'm
you
through with education.
He's through it.
Education.
Well, but you've had some thoughts about it for a while. What is it that led you into to thinking about this and thinking about learning and kids learning and people in general?
Back in 2000, I had been working at a nickel mine as a lab supervisor, and the mine shut down after they passed NAFTA and GATT. And I got a good severance package and was able to become a consultant. So I went to work at a zoo, and it was a drive through zoo, and I was developing math and science programs for talented and gifted students. So the process we were working on was called REDIAL for Research Directed Learning. And we set up programs where high school students could learn protocols and then go out with agency folk from the BLM, the Forest Service, the local county, and other agencies that were going out and collecting scientific data. We would provide resources and development to the students so that they could go and do internships while they were in high school, and it would look good for their admission to college.
And so you've always had kind of a love of math and like maybe even as a personal thing that helped you with life, I guess. Do you think is that correct? Is that how you look at it?
Well, I guess what I never really thought math as being something difficult. It just came naturally. And so I was able to apply math to a whole lot of different things. And I understood the relationship between numbers. At the time, I was still counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, like Sesame Street taught us. But now I no longer count that way. I count 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and just think in the golden mean ratio like nature does. But there's so many different ways that math can be applied. Now, it's one of those things where nature doesn't count in base 10. And so I find a lot of relevance for Fibonacci. I find a lot of relevance for the doubling function. I think life is exponential in nature. So things like the Richter scale, which is a log scale, there are so many things. If you apply different mathematics, they take a different form. But the mathematics is an after the fact thing. If the ultimate control of what's going on is each of us and our belief system, and there's some people who say that belief is the opposite of knowledge, and that if you believe something, but it's the knowledge that builds the belief system. And if you consider something to be true and it's not, that's at your own peril, especially if you know it not to be true. But if you consider truth for its own sake and just assume that you know until you don't know, things tend to work out a lot better than considering everything to be false right off the bat.
Yes, the UCSC voodoo principle of chaos math, I'm pretty sure. I mean, in terms of Heisenberg, you might have just nailed. I was going to ask you about, as we were talking about math a second ago, and in terms of your use of the scientific method, where do you see? I mean, you've obviously found that it has some value, even though there are problems with it. What are the problems with it that you've noticed, which are some of those you were just pointing out? And then how do you wrestle with it, and what is it that you're getting out of? What are you keeping out of it that's still valuable and still works?
I keep math and always use it in a quantitative sense. How many of something you have is how many you have. And the mathematical relationships that we have in measuring quantities of things work very well. The mathematics of measuring the quality of things, there is really no mathematics that measures quality in that sense. But
So
I
we see
had,
things as we are, not as they are. Is there a way that you can see things more clearly so that the scientific method you can revisit something, or?
well, you see, I've never had a problem with looking at things and just seeing the mathematics within what I'm looking at without needing to isolate it from the system. I edited a book written by a guy named Bob Marshall, who worked with Buckminster Fuller back in the day. And Marshall couldn't write a mathematical equation to save his life, but he could visualize everything in mathematical terms. And he came up with a lot of different ideas that went into the architecture that Buckminster Fuller used. And it just seems that if you allow different parts of the whole to be separate, the sum of all the parts is greater than the whole. Now that violates the second law of thermodynamics, where energy in has to equal energy out. But that second law of thermodynamics only holds for closed systems, and we live in open systems, so there's no need to follow that physics.
Well, Marshall's kind of interesting though, because he figured the math might change, and like just look at wilderness, kind of the new Thoreau period. Like look at the way things are working, because we're gonna find there's so much we're missing from that. Do you think that as we're looking at things, we have to continually reanalyze them because we're adding to them by doing that? And if that's the case, like where can we make I mean, does that mean that we have a lot more power? I mean, don't we have then we can have a positive role in our perceptions? And
I think we each have a positive role in perception. I think the world, according to Andreas, works just the way Andreas thinks it works. But if somebody like Lenny or Brittany or somebody else comes and tells you it doesn't work that way, it's up to us to give you the way that it does work so that you have something to grasp that keeps it continuous. People just being negative and telling you, oh no, that's wrong, without giving you what's right in its place, do a true disservice to you when they pop a bubble without replacing it with a different bubble. But I believe in the many worlds theory, and that each time we make a decision, we make both sides of the decision. And so we generate a new world that we're not aware of in this reality that is the other reality. And most of the time, it makes no difference, and those worlds converge back on each other. But every so often, we make a decision that is so life changing that we change our life in this world, but our life in the opposite decision world goes on as if we had never made that decision, and we might live in 2 or 3 or 4 different separate timelines. I think time works a lot differently than anything we've been taught, and that maybe human scale at the individual level is a variable, not a constant, so that we go to sleep at night, we wake up in the morning, and we're in a similar world with a different time constant, and it doesn't have to be continuous to the world we left when we went to sleep last night.
You notice how many people get so little sleep, but they're like, wow, I spent a lifetime in my dreams. And then other people, they spend all of they spend 12 hours or 10 hours sleeping, and they come out and they're like, I didn't get a wink.
Oh, I think that we all have a different individual timeline, but the consensus reality is developed from the merging of all the timelines of all the individuals. So if I wanted to go off and be on my own timeline, I certainly could. If I didn't converse with anyone, I'd get so far out there that I wouldn't have a grasp on the current reality at all. And since we have to live within the current reality, caveat, maybe we don't, but we think we do, I'm not ready to cut all ties. In fact, I'm at the point where I was out of the system well enough that I could make it through a month and not spend a cent. But that doesn't do you any good. You're walking around in dirty laundry and scrounging for what to eat. So you have to play the game with the rules that we're given. I'm entering the system again after having been outside the system for so long that I no longer know the rules of the game. So I sort of feel like I'm the Michael J. Smith character in Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land.
Well, I'm trying to remember the name of that guy just recently they found who lived 27 years alone in the woods. Did you hear about this guy, Christopher Knight, in Maine? So I'll send you a link to it, and I'll put a link to it somewhere. Christopher Knight parked his car at the age of 20 on a remote trail in Maine and walked away with the most basic of his supplies, and he did not ever walk back. So then after 27 years, people started putting security cameras into their winter cabins, and they found that this man was selectively grabbing a few boxes of groceries from open cabins and leaving apologies, and then going back and living in a pile of books that he'd collected. And he was in when eventually, because of that, they caught him and they talked to him, and he apologized profusely. This was the language he spoke in, because he'd only read books, very novel language. So he's well articulated, very interesting guy, but not a bad man. But he, at some point, noticed that in the 80s, society was becoming different than he was going to be capable of adapting to. And he didn't want to kill himself, but he didn't want to interfere. He knew his mother wasn't going to be proud of him. He knew his brother wasn't going to be able to take care of him. He knew he was not capable of functioning in a yuppie system. And he didn't want to be rude to the IRS or anybody. He just wanted to not bother anyone. And so he started living completely all on his own. It seems like that's the kind of answer a lot of like Bob, Marshall even was talking about. Thoreau was talking about Emerson. But then when we do that, then we become so isolated that we're unable to help each other. And I noticed with your radio show, so many people were able to like give just the most small influence in each other's lives that it changed who they were for the better.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting dynamic that we had in the radio show because I firmly believe that every individual should be treated as a unique individual. And I was working on an experiment that crossed group theory with game theory. And the radio show sort of fell into my lap. I was not intending to have a radio show, but I had just recently joined Discord and I was hanging out with a bunch of people and somebody said, "Well, we need DJs on a radio show station." And I said, "Okay, I can do some talk radio and spin some tunes." And one of the portions of the game was to see how many individuals I could actually work with. And by the end of the time at the radio show, I had 37, 38 people that were part of the cast of characters that could appear on the show. And it overwhelmed me. I couldn't keep track of it anymore.
I mean,
But yeah, and so I have a lot of good data in my notebooks about what went on. I have audio copies of all the shows, plus they're on the blockchain. At some point, I'd love to do a data mining project and go back through those shows, listen to them, record what was talked about, and use those as a learning method for people who want to explore alternative methods of doing anything.
yeah, that's the thing that really inspired me about it. It was like, whoa, what the heck did this guy create here? Because I don't know if anyone really like understood all of the little tools that fell into place to make it possible, created something really interesting. There's a really interesting promise in what that could be, because that could really help with the educational system. It's more than just talk radio. I mean, yes, you have some of the better tunes, by the way. Like, I don't know if anyone doesn't know, Lenny can play the music, but at the same time, like, this is an educational experience on the blockchain. Like, there's a secure method for milestone metrics that we could use to help people experience the shared lesson plans that experts, people who've been through experiences, have meta tags. That's amazing. Like, not everyone has figured that out yet. Like, Khan Academy from Microsoft doesn't have that figured out yet. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting because it's like maybe, there's a lot that people could put into that energy of sharing their experiences that way.
Yeah, I think one of the things that just fell into the right place was being able to use Discord as a radio studio, because I don't think at all that it was set up to do that. But I learned that if I could turn the station on my computer and then run Discord through my tablet, that we could talk in the Discord room and broadcast it directly over the air. So instead of just being a place where gamers got together, we started using Discord in a whole completely different new way. And that was the name of the show, was The New Way.
Post came out today with an article. For more than half a century, the intelligence agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, ran and purchased and ran a single company to keep the communications of their spies, soldiers, and diplomats secret. The company, Crypto AG, got its first break with contracts to build coding machines for the U.S. troops during World War II. Flushed with cash, it became a dominant maker of encryption devices for decades, and it did this for many countries. So for a long time, they just control anybody who needed an encryption machine would use their encryption machine, and then they would have the master key to be able to decrypt things. So this is another side of things. It's like when we're looking at a word like Discord and the goddess Eris and things like that, and it makes me wonder, like, these tools that have been presented to us, that have been given, like, for whatever purposes, are they being used? Is Facebook more danger than it's worth. So many people are sharing really useful information on Facebook, and it seems like they're more scared of Facebook now than they are like now they want to dismantle Facebook because people have been using it to seed things like the Egyptian revolution. So maybe somehow they can't avoid some of the good that's coming from, even though they're trying to monitor us with it.
I think that if we're worried about the technology spying on us, it doesn't pay to worry, just assume the technology is spying on us. It's at the point where anything we say is recorded, even if we're not recording it, somebody is. And so I'm not worried at all as long as I speak the truth. If I'm trying to hide stuff and be shaky about things, what I'd rather do is say, hey, let's hold off on this conversation until we can be together somewhere and then we can pick it up again. But there's nothing to really hide in the conversation. I went off the radar screen totally in 2011 when you talked about the guy being out in the woods for 27 years. Well, I only went into the woods for 3 months. But I did go off into the woods, had one other person who I was with, and we set up camp. And I did not leave that camp for 3 months because I wanted to verify to myself that if everything was totally broken down, I could still survive perfectly well. And once I did that, I then moved into my van and spent 6 or 7 years living out of my van, and eventually sold it to move to Colorado, moved back to Oregon, and have been sort of living on the edge. And that it worked very well when I started doing it. Unfortunately, the system as it is has put enough people into the position of living on the edge that people are no longer willing to help people and give them the benefit of the doubt. It's all about what can you do for me lately? And that's not a real good world to be in.
Especially when it's a by the minute. It reminded me of the conversation we had about Oumuamua, which was this cigar-shaped craft, right? This idea that there's this giant meteor or something that NASA said came to Earth about a year and a half ago, came right around the solar system, got white hot, and then jut off. And then now we have this 16-day repeating signal. I'm going to send that also as a link to make sure I get that accurately. But it's an interesting one because it's actually like a 4-day thing every 16.35 days. And so you love math. I was wondering what you think would be like a good way to start looking at that and see what's the metaphor here, or what's going on if that's a signal. Like what would that be about?
I kind of thought that what it is it's part of a sine wave, and that we only have perception in certain regions of the spectrum, so that we're picking it up as it passes maybe in its path to the nadir, and then we're picking it up again as it passes in its path to the apex. And since a sine wave goes up to the apex, down to the nadir, up to the apex, down to the nadir, if we've just got one region that we're seeing it in a period where the period is probably twice the length of what we're seeing, or 32 days. So if we could calculate a frequency of one wave every 32 days, you can imagine this is a huge wave in the spectrum. It's got to be very, very long time framed. But if every different size of scale it is a different time constant, then we could have an entire 80-year life that took a millisecond. We could have an entire 80-year life that's on the 26,000-year Mayan calendar. And if it's normalized to human 80 years, we couldn't tell the difference. So I think some people on Earth are on that 26,000 year scale. Other people are on the microsecond scale. And from the microsecond scale, we might have 10 billion Earths, each lasting for a microsecond, each dealing with the same problem until one of them gets a solution that's viable. It then changes scale and goes for a longer period of time to do more test work. And so the things that happen on, say, the 26,000 year scale are things that are, everything gets filtered off, and only the things that really have a chance of changing the human nature of existence actually end up being tested on that scale.
Wow. So, I mean, that's interesting because that fully synchronizes with some of the stories about 26,000 year lifetimes, or even just years, 26,000 years for. And then I think Chardin and Lemaire both talked about time as being a degradation from radiation from particular sources. So if you had another source as your degradation, then it could take 26,000 year cycles instead of a 360-day.
There's another thing that I've been thinking, and that is that maybe what we're looking at in the sky is actually the internals in our body, and all the stars are like cell nuclei, and we can't see the matter structure. We only see the nuclei lighting up. And so maybe what we're taught is very large is actually very small, but on a different time frame. Maybe the pyramids are just crystal structures that have been grown by giants, and they're plucked out and put down, and they don't even notice that our world has existing beings on a smaller scale. I tend to wonder if the microbe scale is loaded with humans who think their whole existence exists within that realm of a microbe.
The
And
Horton Hears the Who, you
yeah,
know.
there's no way you could tell from the perspective of being embedded, but it certainly seems to me that a lot of the work that Mike's doing, Stillian, that's really good work, and it's telling me that there's a biological relationship that it exists in terms of different scales, and we're not even thinking about those.
Soil could represent biology and how biology would pick up its ideas from geology. Because if microbes are shifting geology around to make shapes that would then make sense in biology, then biology would repeat those patterns. And we might find very large scale versions of living systems that are run by them. Um,
Yeah, I think that because of the compartmentalization of our sciences in the university structure that we have a lot of people who know the same things with whole different sets of terminology and different viewpoints, and they all live in their own little micro world with their goggles on, and they don't realize that if they talk to somebody who's doing the same thing from a different vantage point, there might be great insight. uh, Something like flow works great for electrons in chemistry. It works great for water and plumbing systems. It works great in electrical energy when you're designing a chip. And yet each one of those systems treats flow totally differently, and there's no real communications between electrical engineers, plumbers, and chemists.
There is an interesting law of equivalency, though, I've noticed, and the only people who seem to pick up on that are like in the trades. It's like the blue collar guys that are actually dealing with it. They're like, oh, yeah, the pipe has to be about the same width as an electrical copper pipe has to be for energy to flow as water, or for air for their ventilation systems.
I think right now we have a big problem in our education system. that it doesn't work. It's not there to educate us. It is there to cause cognitive dissonance and keep us apart. The idea of everything being in its own compartment and each of the compartments having its own language and being taught differently has created a world that's just like the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. We're all talking English. We're not using the same words to mean the same things. We're using the same words to mean different things. And so that's one of the puns of the new way. I spell it Knewweigh because we have to take everything we thought we knew and weigh it again in terms of what we know now. But I'm amazed at how many speakers I see on YouTube talking about new ways of doing things. And I know that I had the right meme. I was just way ahead of the time.
Another kind of math than base 10? Like, what does that even mean to a normal person, you know?
There are a lot of different forms of math besides base 10, but base 10 is the idea that we've got 10 digits in our base structure, 0 through 9. And so everything we do is structured as an order of 10 so that we know that 10 times something is 1 divided by 10 is 0.1. 1 times 10 is 10. 10 times 10 is 100. And everything, well, the metric system is set up as a base 10 accumulator. Now, we in America have this funny system of measuring things in inches and feet and other things. And I think this is just something handed down to make it even more Babelian.
That's an interesting clue. Yeah, like, because I think it's so practical that all math would be based on 10 then. Why would you ever do anything else then?
Yeah, but we have computers, and it's funny because if you look at a bit or a byte in a computer, it's all a sequence of zeros and ones. And the 8 bits that make up a byte allow you to count up to 64 in just 0 and 1 in 8 different digits. And so the sequence of the zeros and ones can say a lot. That's binary. But computers wouldn't work if it didn't also have hexadecimal, which takes 0 through 9, adds A, B, C, D, E, and F, and gives you a programming language that's based on 256 instead of 100. That's 16 times 16. And so I like to use base 8. 8 by 8 gives you a grid of 64. That's like a chessboard. Yep, and 232s make 64. And there's all sorts of symmetry arrangements in life. I think the group theory in chemistry that I learned, which has a lot to do with the spatial arrangements of the geometry of atoms and molecules, comes about because every molecule wants to be as far apart from every other molecule as possible. It's the atoms in the molecule that want to be far apart from each other, but they're connected by chemical bonds. And there's 2 types of chemical bond. There's the covalent bond, which is a sharing of electrons, and there's an ionic bond, which is gifting an electron and then having an electrostatic charge arrangement. But if you go back to the works of Walter Russell, who was in the first half of the 20th century, his way of looking at chemistry is completely different than what we've been taught in school. And I think there's a lot of stuff from people like Wilhelm Reich, Steiner, Schauberger, Walter Russell, Rife, that schools don't deal with. They don't want anybody to know that information, and they want everyone to believe the narrative as they teach it. Well, you and I both know those narratives break down. We have this whole world of Tartary. And the world of Tartary certainly makes sense to those who have dove into it to explore it deeper. There's some great work on star forts and other aspects of things that to me have clearly demonstrated that the history we've been presented with is more fiction than most novels. So if they're giving us truth in the fiction and fiction is truth, where are we to discern how things really are?
How much can we get out of sound? Like what can sound do for you?
Sound is just another series of wavelengths, just like light is. And so, if we can imagine light healing, we can imagine sound healing. I think it's very important, but that the entire spectrum of vibration is not just sound and light, but it all follows through the same patterns. I think music is pretty much a key to the healing of sound, and that one of the things I'd love to see is if we could take all the 440 hertz music and reprogram it into 432 hertz music and get it so that the music was actually at the vibrational wavelengths that affected humans. It's part of the 369 Tesla work, although I think right now a lot of people are assigning things to Tesla that don't belong to Tesla, that they've just disappeared enough scientists of the Tesla era that it's easy to let Tesla be the genius and not mention anyone else. It's the same motif as Einstein being the genius and nobody from his time period being mentioned anymore either. Einstein was a patent clerk. He wasn't even a scientist.
But he had a wise girlfriend who helped him interpret some of those patents. That's usually what helps. It makes me think though, if all of the science that had been lost is coming out again, I mean, is it going to be also that we're creating some things, and isn't that okay? Isn't it okay that we're finding some things halfway truth, and that we're then critically analyzing them? Is that
Very
going
much
to?
it's okay. And in fact, it's got to be okay to allow individuals to come up with a path that totally disagrees with the way we think it works, and not tell them that they're wrong, but encourage them to explore that path even deeper. If you take Fibonacci and you look at that ratio 1.61 and you work it out, it pretty much every ratio between the Fibonacci numbers triangulates back to that 1.61. And so you figure that if you're at 3, it's 2 to 1, 67% versus 33%. By the time you move to 5, it's 3 to 2, 60-40. And then everything else gets even sharper than that. Well, life is pretty much you have the 60% path and the 40% path, the major path and the minor path. But we're not in a duality, we're in a trinity. And that third path is whatever an individual can think of and go out on their own as a path. And if you take the path less traveled, the minor path, it's like Democrats and Republicans. They're the only two choices. But if you could get a third party and build it and have a totally different way of doing things, I think that there's a lot of things that are specifically kept off limits to us as humans that we could rediscover and find of great value if we can get out of our own heads.
This program is coming to you via Relay 2 satellite, a spacecraft orbiting the Earth at a speed of over 17,000 miles per hour.
Recent Tartarian.